It was just like any other morning. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft orange glow through the windows of Joey's diner, a small, cozy spot in the middle of the town. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, and the sound of sizzling bacon and eggs mixed with the quiet chatter of the few early risers who came in for their morning meals. The diner was peaceful, the kind of place where everyone knew each other and exchanged small talk over a cup of coffee. Mr. Jenkins, an elderly black man in his late 70s, was one of the regulars at the diner. He had been coming to Joey's every day for the past several years, always arriving early. He liked the quiet mornings before the crowd came in. He would sit in the same corner booth by the window, order his coffee, and slowly read the newspaper while enjoying his peaceful time. He wasn't a man of many words, but his presence was always comforting. His face had wrinkles that told the story of a long life lived with both joy and hardship. His eyes, though tired, still carried the weight of many memories, some painful, some proud. He didn't say much, but his calm, quiet demeanor spoke volumes. As Mr. Jenkins sat down at his usual spot and waited for his coffee, the door swung open with a loud bang. A group of loud bikers entered the diner. They were the kind of people who liked to make their presence known. Their leather jackets and long beards gave them a tough look. They all looked like they belonged to some kind of club, the kind that wasn't easily intimidated and didn't care much for the rules. The bikers were laughing loudly as they walked up to the counter, their voices echoing through the quiet diner. The air seemed to shift as they settled into a nearby booth, their loud chatter disrupting the calm atmosphere. Mr. Jenkins didn't look up. He was used to the noise by now. It didn't bother him much. He had seen a lot in his life and had learned to let things slide. But today, the bikers didn't seem interested in being quiet. As they sat down, one of them, the leader, it seemed, looked over at Mr. Jenkins. He was a tall man with a thick beard and a heavy build. His eyes glinted mischievously as he nudged his friends and pointed at the elderly man sitting alone. The bikers laughed even louder, thinking it was funny that someone so old was sitting in such a quiet place, far away from their rowdy energy. "Look at that old man," the biker said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Must be lonely, huh? Just look at him, sitting there with his coffee and newspaper, like he's in his own little world." The others chuckled along, some of them even making faces at Mr. Jenkins, as though it was some kind of joke. Mr. Jenkins didn't react. He didn't show anger or frustration. He just stared out the window, his eyes watching the world outside. The bikers, feeling brave, grew bolder. They started making even louder comments, laughing at Mr. Jenkins' old age and his quiet nature. They didn't know him, but they didn't care. To them, he was just another old man who wouldn't dare stand up for himself. The bikers continued to laugh and joke, growing bolder with each passing minute. They didn't care who they disturbed or who heard them. The noise seemed to fill every corner of the diner, bouncing off the walls. As Mr. Jenkins sat quietly by the window, sipping his coffee, he noticed the shadows of their figures growing larger as they moved closer to him. They didn't just want to make fun of him from a distance. They wanted him to hear their jokes too. The leader of the group, a tall man with a scruffy beard and dark sunglasses, stood up and walked over to Mr. Jenkins's booth. The sound of his heavy boots echoed on the wooden floor as he approached. He leaned down a little too close to Mr. Jenkins, his breath smelling of cigarette smoke and strong coffee. "Hey, old man," the biker said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You're not afraid of us, are you? You know, I've never seen someone your age in a place like this. What are you doing here all by yourself?" Mr. Jenkins didn't look up from his newspaper. He knew exactly what the biker was doing, trying to get a rise out of him, but he wasn't going to fall for it. Instead, he took another sip of his coffee, his hand steady and calm, his gaze fixed on the words on the page. The biker wasn't satisfied with the silence. He nudged Mr. Jenkins's table harder, making the coffee cup rattle. "You're just sitting there like you don't even care," he said. "Aren't you going to say anything?" The rest of the bikers snickered from their booth, enjoying the show. They thought it was funny to make the old man feel small, to see if they could get him to talk back or defend himself. But Mr. Jenkins didn't react. His face remained peaceful, his expression unreadable. He had learned long ago not to respond to people who sought trouble. But the bikers didn't stop. They were used to intimidating others, used to getting attention whenever they entered a room. So they decided to take it a step further. One of the younger bikers, much quieter than the rest, slid out of the booth and walked over to the counter. He looked at Mr. Jenkins's cup of coffee, then looked back at his friends. With a smirk, he picked up a napkin and wiped his mouth, then casually leaned over and spat into Mr. Jenkins's coffee. The diner was still for a moment. It wasn't a loud act, but it was an act that carried a message. The bikers wanted to show their power, to humiliate the old man in front of everyone. They expected him to get upset, to stand up and yell at them. But Mr. Jenkins didn't do anything. Instead, he continued to sit there, his fingers still wrapped around the cup, though now his coffee had been ruined. He didn't even blink. His eyes were still fixed on the paper in front of him. The bikers waited for something. Maybe a word, maybe a reaction. But Mr. Jenkins remained as still as ever, his calm presence seeming to make the entire situation even more uncomfortable for them. The younger biker, who had spit in the coffee, looked nervously at his friends. The laughter slowly faded as they all realized something. They had crossed a line, and Mr. Jenkins hadn't flinched. The power they expected to have over him hadn't worked. They were starting to feel unsure. The diner was filled with an awkward silence. The loud, boisterous laughter of the bikers had faded, replaced by a tense quiet that seemed to stretch on forever. Mr. Jenkins had not moved, not even to wipe the spittle from his coffee. He simply sat there, his fingers lightly resting on the cup, his gaze still fixed on the newspaper. It was as if nothing had happened. To the bikers, this was strange. They were used to people reacting to their taunts, getting angry or upset. But Mr. Jenkins wasn't giving them the satisfaction. The younger biker who had spat in Mr. Jenkins's coffee shifted uncomfortably. He glanced at his friends, then back at the elderly man. The others were still laughing, but their laughs had lost some of their edge. There was something about Mr. Jenkins's calmness that made them uneasy. They were used to being the ones in control, the ones who made everyone else feel small. But now, they weren't so sure. One of the bikers nudged the leader, a burly man with a thick beard, and whispered something to him. The leader raised his eyebrows, then stood up. He walked over to Mr. Jenkins's booth, his boots heavy on the diner's wooden floor. The group watched, intrigued, as he stood beside the elderly man. His shadow loomed over Mr. Jenkins, but still, the old man did not react. "Come on, old man, don't you have anything to say?" the leader asked, his voice a little softer now. "Are you really going to let us make fun of you like this?" Mr. Jenkins didn't look up. He took another sip of his coffee, and the silence continued. To the bikers, this was strange. It was as though he was completely unaffected by them. Most people would have shouted, argued, or at least made some kind of response. But Mr. Jenkins did nothing. He just sat there, unbothered. The leader, now feeling a little awkward, leaned down a bit closer. "You know, we're just messing around," he said, his tone changing slightly. "It's all in good fun. Don't take it so seriously." Mr. Jenkins still didn't respond. His hands were steady as he placed the cup down gently on the table. His eyes, still focused on the newspaper, never shifted. It was as if he had already experienced worse things in his life than the taunts of a group of rowdy bikers, and their words had no power over him. For a moment, the leader of the bikers stood there, unsure of what to do. He had expected a reaction, a shout, something that would make him feel powerful again. But all he got was silence. He glanced back at his friends, who were starting to look uncomfortable. Some of them were even starting to shift in their seats, realizing that the situation wasn't as fun as they had thought. Feeling unsure, the leader slowly straightened up. "All right, old man," he muttered, walking back to his table. "We're done here." His voice wasn't as loud now, and the bikers' once confident and mocking behavior had started to fade. They turned their attention back to their food. But the air in the diner had changed. The power had shifted. Mr. Jenkins, still calm and collected, didn't pay them any more attention. He finished his coffee, placed the empty cup down, and folded his newspaper neatly. He had not been shaken, not in the slightest. The bikers may have thought they were in control, but now they were the ones who felt out of place. Mr. Jenkins's quiet strength had silenced them. The silence in the diner stretched on, but it wasn't the same silence from before. The bikers, who had once been so loud and confident, were now uncomfortably quiet. They glanced at each other, unsure of how to continue. Mr. Jenkins, still sitting at his booth, seemed completely unaffected by their sudden shift in mood. His calmness had diffused their bravado, leaving them to wonder what kind of man they were dealing with. The leader of the bikers, who had been the most vocal earlier, sat back in his seat and let out a heavy sigh. He didn't know what to make of this old man. He'd seen plenty of people stand up to him, some angry, some scared, but never someone who seemed so completely unaffected by his presence. It bothered him. It bothered the whole group. Finally, the leader decided to try something different. He got up from his seat again and walked slowly toward Mr. Jenkins's booth. This time, he wasn't trying to provoke him or get a rise out of him. Instead, his voice was softer, more curious. "You're one tough guy," the leader said, glancing at Mr. Jenkins's weathered face. "What's your deal, old man? You don't talk much, but you sure know how to stay quiet when things get tough." Mr. Jenkins took a deep breath, then folded his newspaper. He glanced up at the biker, his calm eyes meeting the leader's gaze for the first time. The years of experience in Mr. Jenkins's eyes weren't lost on the biker. For the first time, the leader started to realize that this wasn't just some old man. There was something else about him, something deeper. "I've learned to stay quiet over the years," Mr. Jenkins said quietly. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made the biker stop in his tracks. Sometimes it's better not to speak, especially when words don't matter. His voice was steady, calm, but there was a hint of something else, something the biker couldn't quite put his finger on. The leader didn't know what to say to that. For a moment, the words stuck in his throat, and he stood there awkwardly. The rest of the bikers, watching from their booth, had started to feel the shift in the air. The confidence they once had was fading. The man in front of them was no ordinary old man. "Where did you learn that, old man?" the leader asked after a moment, trying to sound casual. But there was a hint of respect in his voice now, something he hadn't expected to feel. Mr. Jenkins took another slow sip of his coffee before answering. "I learned it in a place where silence was all I had left," he said softly. "A long time ago, I was sent to a place where the world didn't care about me, where noise didn't help, and neither did fighting back." The biker blinked, not fully understanding what Mr. Jenkins meant, but sensing that this wasn't just some story about being quiet. Mr. Jenkins's calm eyes, the way he spoke without anger or fear, began to tell a different story. A story the biker wasn't prepared to hear. Mr. Jenkins didn't elaborate further. He didn't need to. The tone of his voice, the weight of his words, was enough. The leader stood there, feeling an unexpected mixture of guilt and respect. There was a shift in the room. The bikers had been laughing at Mr. Jenkins just moments ago, but now they were quiet, unsure of how to respond. For the first time, they began to realize that Mr. Jenkins wasn't just an old man with nothing to offer. He had been through more than they could imagine, and it showed in his eyes. The room felt different now, quieter, almost reverent. The bikers exchanged looks, but no one dared to speak. The leader of the group was still standing near Mr. Jenkins's booth, his curiosity growing stronger. He had never met someone like this before. The old man had said something that caught his attention, something that made him rethink everything he thought he knew about power and strength. For a moment, the leader hesitated. He wanted to know more. What had Mr. Jenkins meant when he talked about the place where silence was all I had left? What had happened to him that made him so calm, so unshaken, even in the face of their mockery? "I don't mean to pry," the leader said slowly, trying to sound more respectful than before. "But you've been through something, haven't you? Something that changed you." Mr. Jenkins didn't immediately answer. He looked out the window for a moment, his expression distant, as if he were seeing something far away. Then, with a sigh, he set his coffee cup down gently on the table and looked back at the biker. "Yes, I've been through a lot," Mr. Jenkins said quietly. "But it wasn't just me who went through it. There were others. Friends. Brothers." His voice softened as if recalling something painful. "You asked where I learned silence. I learned it in Vietnam." The leader's eyes widened. For the first time, he felt a deep sense of respect for the old man. He had heard stories about the Vietnam War, about the soldiers who fought there, but he had never really understood what it meant until now. Mr. Jenkins saw the change in the biker's face. He could tell the leader was listening more intently now. The other bikers, who had been whispering among themselves, fell silent. Even the ones who had been mocking him earlier were now paying attention. "I was just a kid back then," Mr. Jenkins continued. "Younger than you might think. We were sent to fight in a place that wasn't like home. It wasn't like anything we'd ever seen. We lost a lot of good men there. And we saw things that no one should ever see. Things that change you. Things that make you realize that what you think is important doesn't really matter." He paused, his voice growing quieter. "Out there, in the jungle, fighting, silence was the only thing that kept me going. Sometimes, you couldn't make a sound, not even a whisper. You had to hold your breath, stay still, stay quiet, or else." Mr. Jenkins's voice trailed off, and for a moment, there was nothing but the soft clinking of silverware and the faint hum of the diner's kitchen in the background. The bikers didn't interrupt. They didn't laugh or make jokes. They were hearing something they hadn't expected. A story they hadn't thought would come from the mouth of the quiet old man sitting in the corner. "I learned that when you've seen so much pain, you can't be shaken by small things anymore," Mr. Jenkins said, his voice steady again. "What you thought was important doesn't matter when you've been through real suffering. What matters is that you keep going, no matter what happens around you." The leader stood there, his mouth slightly open, stunned by Mr. Jenkins's words. The other bikers looked at each other, unsure of what to say. The atmosphere in the diner had completely changed. The respect for the old man was palpable now, and the once rowdy bikers were now quiet, thoughtful. Mr. Jenkins didn't seem to need their admiration or their apology. He had already made his point. The bikers had mocked him for being old and quiet, but now they realized that this old man had been through more than any of them could imagine, and somehow he had come out stronger for it. The room was still. No one spoke, and the sounds of the diner, usually full of chatter and clinking silverware, seemed to have faded into the background. All that remained was the quiet figure of Mr. Jenkins, sitting calmly at his booth. His words had made a deep impact on the group of bikers, more than anyone could have imagined. The leader, still standing near Mr. Jenkins, shifted uncomfortably on his feet. He was trying to process what he had just heard. The old man, this quiet figure he had mocked, had shared something so deep and personal. It wasn't something the leader had expected. The other bikers, too, seemed lost in thought, staring down at their plates or into their coffee cups. For a moment, no one knew what to say. The leader cleared his throat, his voice quieter now than it had been earlier. I didn't know," he said, his tone softer. "I didn't know you went through all that." Mr. Jenkins looked up at him, his calm gaze still steady. "Most people don't know," he said simply. "And sometimes they don't need to. What matters is how you carry what you've been through." His words weren't spoken with bitterness or anger, but with a quiet wisdom that seemed to come from a place deep inside. The leader's face softened as he stood there, processing Mr. Jenkins's words. "I'm sorry for what we did," he said, his voice sincere. "That wasn't right." The other bikers, who had been watching in silence, began to murmur in agreement. They realized that their earlier behavior, their mockery and rude jokes, had been disrespectful. They had crossed a line, and now they could see it clearly. The old man, the one they had tried to put down, had shown them a strength none of them had expected. His resilience, his ability to stay calm in the face of their cruelty, had made them realize how small their actions really were. One of the bikers, a younger man with a shaved head, stood up from his seat. He walked over to Mr. Jenkins, his steps slow and hesitant. "We were wrong," he said, his voice uncertain but genuine. "We shouldn't have treated you like that. I don't know what you've been through, but I can see now you're not just some old guy sitting in a diner. You're something more." The leader nodded. "Yeah, you're right. We've been pretty ignorant about what real strength is." He paused, looking at Mr. Jenkins. "I hope you can forgive us for what we did." Mr. Jenkins looked at them all, his expression still calm. He didn't need their apology. He didn't need them to feel sorry. The peace he had within himself was more than enough. But he nodded slowly, a sign that he accepted their words. "Forgiveness is a gift, but it's not something I give lightly," Mr. Jenkins said, his voice low but firm. "But I'll tell you this, if you've learned something from today, then that's all that matters. I don't hold grudges. I've seen too much to hold on to anything anymore." The bikers stood there, humbled. They could tell that Mr. Jenkins wasn't just talking about forgiveness in the typical sense. He was talking about something deeper, about letting go of pain, of anger, of things that hold you back. And in that moment, they realized they had been given a lesson far more valuable than anything they could have imagined. As they returned to their booth, they sat quietly, each man reflecting on what had just happened. The laughter and mockery had disappeared, replaced by a newfound respect for the old man they had once thought of as easy to mock. Mr. Jenkins had shown them that real strength doesn't come from being loud or tough. It comes from within, and no amount of mockery could take that away. The atmosphere in the diner had completely changed. The loud, disruptive bikers who had once filled the room with their voices now sat quietly, their food forgotten. Even their usual joking had stopped. It was as if the entire group had been transformed by the conversation they'd just had with Mr. Jenkins. The hum of the diner's kitchen, the clinking of silverware, and the soft voices of the other customers became the backdrop to the unusual silence in the room. Mr. Jenkins, for his part, didn't seem to mind the change. He continued to sit in his booth, sipping his coffee, seemingly unaffected by the shift in mood. To him, this moment wasn't about gaining any kind of recognition or apology. It was about something deeper. He knew that people would come and go, and they would either learn something from him or leave unchanged. It was the nature of life. But in that moment, he felt a small sense of satisfaction. Not because the bikers had apologized, but because they had learned something that might stay with them for the rest of their lives. The leader of the group was still sitting with his head down, staring at his plate. He couldn't stop thinking about what Mr. Jenkins had said, about the pain he had endured, and how it had shaped him into the person he was today. He had never considered that strength might look so different from the way he had always imagined it. He had thought that toughness came from being loud, from being the one who dominated a room. But Mr. Jenkins had shown him that true strength came from silence, from holding onto your dignity in the face of everything life threw at you. After a few moments, the leader of the bikers looked up. He met Mr. Jenkins's eyes again, this time with a different kind of respect. "You know what," he said, his voice a little shaky. "I spent my whole life thinking I knew what real strength was, but I don't think I really understood it until now. You've taught me something I didn't know I needed to learn." Mr. Jenkins smiled slightly, but it wasn't a smile of pride. It was a smile of understanding, the kind that comes from knowing that you've shared something important with someone else. He didn't respond to the leader's words because there was nothing more to say. The lesson had been learned, and that was enough. The younger biker, who had initially mocked Mr. Jenkins, also looked up. "I'm sorry for what I did," he said, his voice quieter than before. I didn't think about how my actions could affect someone else. I thought I was just having fun, but I see now it wasn't fun for you. I didn't know you'd been through so much." Mr. Jenkins nodded. "That's all right, son," he said softly. "Most people don't understand. But when you do, you change. And that's all anyone can hope for." The bikers sat there, contemplating his words. The quiet in the room felt different now. The mockery and the laughter that had once filled the space had been replaced by an unspoken understanding. There was no need for more apologies or explanations. The respect that had been earned was enough. The leader stood up and motioned to his friends. "Let's go," he said quietly. The others nodded and stood up with him. But this time, they didn't leave with the same attitude they had walked in with. They had been humbled. They had learned a lesson that would stay with them. As they left the diner, the leader turned back toward Mr. Jenkins, who was still sitting calmly at his booth. "Thank you," he said simply, before the door closed behind him. Mr. Jenkins didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He had given them something far more valuable than any words could offer. He had given them a glimpse of true strength, and in doing so, he had shown them what it meant to live with dignity. As the bikers walked out of Joey's diner, a heavy silence remained in the air. They didn't speak as they climbed onto their motorcycles, their minds still processing everything that had happened. The loud, confident group that had entered the diner earlier was no longer the same. They had been changed, not by anything dramatic or forceful, but by the quiet strength of one elderly man who had simply chosen to stay calm in the face of cruelty. Inside the diner, Mr. Jenkins continued to sit at his booth, just as he had before. His coffee was finished, and the newspaper lay folded neatly in front of him. He wasn't looking for praise or recognition. To him, this moment was simply another part of his life, another lesson learned and shared, without fanfare. But there was a quiet sense of satisfaction in his heart, knowing that despite the mockery and disrespect he had faced, something good had come from it. He had not needed to raise his voice or make a big scene. The truth of his strength had spoken for itself. The other customers in the diner went back to their meals, unaware of the powerful moment that had just unfolded. They continued talking in low voices, but the energy in the room had changed. Even if they didn't know what had happened, the quiet respect that lingered in the air was undeniable. It wasn't just Mr. Jenkins who had been affected by the events of the morning. Everyone in the diner could feel the shift, even if they didn't fully understand it. As for the bikers, they spent the rest of their day in silence, each lost in their thoughts. The leader, especially, couldn't stop thinking about the old man's words. Mr. Jenkins had taught him something he never expected to learn. He had always believed that strength came from being loud, from standing out and being in control. But Mr. Jenkins had shown him that true strength wasn't about power or attention. It was about patience, humility, and the ability to endure without becoming bitter. The leader now understood what real strength looked like, and it was far different from anything he had ever imagined. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the town, the group of bikers gathered at a nearby park. They sat on their motorcycles, not talking, but still feeling the weight of the morning's encounter. The leader looked around at his friends, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Finally, he broke the silence. "I don't know about you guys, but I think that old man taught me more in those few minutes than I've learned in a long time," he said, his voice thoughtful. The others nodded in agreement, though no one spoke at first. They had all felt the impact of Mr. Jenkins's calm, unwavering presence. It wasn't just about the apology they had given him. It was about the lesson he had imparted, a lesson that would stay with them long after they had left the diner. Back at Joey's diner, the owner, who had watched the entire encounter from the counter, leaned over to the waitress with a smile. "I've seen a lot of things in this diner," he said softly, "but I've never seen a group of bikers walk out like that before." The waitress smiled too, watching as Mr. Jenkins stood up from his booth and walked to the door. "You never know who you'll meet in here," she said, her voice filled with quiet admiration. Mr. Jenkins stepped out into the cool evening air, his steps steady and slow. He didn't need anyone to tell him what had happened. He already knew. The bikers had learned something important today, something that he didn't need to explain. And that, in itself, was enough. As Mr. Jenkins walked down the street, the quiet of the evening wrapped around him like a comforting blanket. He had made a difference, not by fighting or shouting, but by simply being himself. And that was the greatest victory of all. The days after the encounter at Joey's diner seemed to pass quietly, but something had changed in the small town. Mr. Jenkins went back to his usual routine, walking to the diner each morning, sitting in his favorite booth and sipping his coffee in peace. But the memory of what had happened that day stayed with him, and it stayed with the bikers too. The leader of the bikers, a man who had always prided himself on his toughness, began to look at life differently. He still wore his leather jacket, still rode his motorcycle with the same pride, but something inside him had shifted. He found himself thinking back to that quiet moment in the diner, when Mr. Jenkins had spoken about strength and silence. It was a lesson he didn't expect, but one that had stayed with him. One afternoon, the leader sat down with some of his friends in a quiet park. They hadn't talked much about the diner visit since that day, but it was clear that it had made an impact. They had all been changed, though none of them could quite put it into words. Finally, the leader spoke up. "I've been thinking about that old man a lot lately," he said, looking at his friends. "You know, I thought I understood what it meant to be strong. But Mr. Jenkins, he showed me something different. Strength isn't about shouting. It's about knowing when to be quiet, when to just endure and keep going." The other bikers nodded slowly, each of them reflecting on the same lesson. The young biker, who had initially mocked Mr. Jenkins, the one who had spat into his coffee, found himself especially moved. He realized how wrong he had been. His actions had come from a place of ignorance, and now he wanted to make things right. "I didn't get it at first," the younger biker admitted, his voice sincere. "But now I see what Mr. Jenkins meant. I've been living my life thinking I had to always prove something, always act tough. But I think I've learned that real strength comes from being calm, from knowing who you are." The group was quiet for a moment, each of them lost in thought. The lesson that Mr. Jenkins had taught them wasn't just about how to act around others. It was about how to live their lives. They realized they had been so focused on showing their power that they had missed what really mattered: being strong enough to face the world with dignity, no matter what. Back at Joey's diner, the owner had noticed a change too. The bikers, who had been regulars at the diner, started to come in more often. But this time, they weren't loud or disruptive. They were quiet, respectful. The jokes and mockery had disappeared, replaced with a calm understanding. Even the other customers, who had once been nervous around the bikers, began to notice the difference. Mr. Jenkins, as always, continued his daily visits to the diner. He never mentioned what had happened. He never needed to. To him, it wasn't about the bikers' apology or how they had changed. It was about knowing that, for once, someone had learned from the silence he had chosen. It was enough for him to know that his quiet strength had made a difference, even if no one else spoke of it. One morning, as Mr. Jenkins finished his coffee and stood up to leave, the leader of the bikers walked into the diner. This time, he didn't hesitate. He walked straight over to Mr. Jenkins, who was just about to leave. "Hey, Mr. Jenkins," the leader said, his voice full of respect. "I just wanted to say thank you. I've been thinking a lot about what you said. You really changed how I see things." Mr. Jenkins smiled slightly, tipping his hat. "I didn't do anything," he said softly. "You learned that on your own." And with that, Mr. Jenkins walked out into the quiet morning, leaving behind a group of bikers who had learned the true meaning of strength.